Sri Lanka is the country of the year. Economists, I think, should get real. I mean, we know which agenda they're promoting, but I think Sri Lanka, with its track record, two elections, September 21st, the presidential elections, and November 12th, the parliamentary elections, conducted peacefully, and the transfer of power done smoothly. Now, I think we in India tend to take it for granted, but as you pointed out, look at our neighborhood. I mean, Sri Lanka actually shines out among our neighboring countries as a beacon of democracy.
Welcome to The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very special guest today is Ambassador Yash Sinha, who served as High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, as High Commissioner to the UK. He's also served on the Pakistan-Afghanistan-Iran desk for a long time. It's a very sensitive desk. And post-retirement, he was the Chief Information Commissioner till about a year or so ago, right? Till I think last 23. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
We're going to talk today about Sri Lanka and the visit of President Dissanayake to India and the implication that it has for the bilateral relationship. So, President Dissanayake is coming here. From all reports that I get about the whole interaction, seems to have gone off very, very well. Would that be your assessment too?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. I think the visit is significant, particularly significant because it follows very closely after the presidential and parliamentary elections, and of course, India being the first port of call for President Anura Kumara Dissanayake. But I think what is also important is that if you see the background, the JVP, which is the main component of the National People's Power that is ruling Sri Lanka currently, has a history. The 1971 armed insurrection against the Sri Lankan government, and then again in 87, 89, specifically against the deployment of the IPKF and the India-Sri Lanka Accords. Now, with that as the history, I think it's significant that President Dissanayake has decided that India is an important, perhaps the most important neighbor, and that he decided to visit India very early on in his term as president. And I think it's also important because there have been so many developments that have taken place since then. And India itself was the first responder during the tsunami in 2004, but more importantly during the protests, the Araglia protests in 2022, and the economic crisis that resulted. So I think it's important, very significant, and I think kudos to the government for a very astute diplomacy in this regard.
So, sir, the thing is that what would you think would be the tangible outcomes of this visit? I mean, I understand that, there was an article that came which said there were a lot of promises that were made from both sides, but other than the fact that he came here and, spoke to us, which itself, as you said, is a big deal, what?
No, I think, you see, if you read the joint statement, I mean, the agreements per se are quite anodyne, that were MOUs, but then there's so many agreements signed. But if you read the joint statement, I think it's important because, one, it shows continuity over the previous governments. And considering the break with the previous government and the previous governments that the victory of the NPP, National People's Power, represents, the fact that the projects, the programs, etc., that were ongoing are being continued is significant by itself. But what I find the most significant about this joint statement is the reference to concluding a framework for defense cooperation.
Yes, of
because
course.
that is something which, if I recall correctly, since 1987, I haven't seen that so explicitly mentioned in any joint statement. Of course, the defense cooperation between our two countries are very close and very, very significant in terms of training, in terms of equipment. Over the years, it's not, and all the arms of, or most of the arms of the armed forces, and including the Coast Guards. So I think the fact that it's mentioned upfront and that there is likelihood of a framework being concluded, I think is important, and we must take note of that.
So levity, I think defense, putting it out there is more important than, the fact that it's been put into words. But sir, I've been talking to some Sri Lankans who have been during the elections. And one of the arguments that I keep hearing is that India has closed its market to us. And so, whereas, they're putting in a lot of stuff into our country. How valid is that argument?
To some extent, they have a point, but I think largely no. And the reason why I say that is one of the earliest free trade agreements concluded by India was with Sri Lanka. And in that sense, it was path-breaking. It was over 24 years ago that this agreement was signed. And since then, trade has expanded considerably, but not up to potential, really, because we could do much more. And the reason being that even with the introduction of the South Asian free trade area, there have been the SAFTA, there have been some roadblocks. And I know that when I was in Sri Lanka, but that was 8 years ago,
Right.
there were constant complaints about some of their main exports, like spices,
Tea.
like pepper, like tea. Now, tea, of course, we are a major producer. In fact, we produce largely for our domestic consumption, and we export small quantities, while Sri Lanka exports a very large, that's one of their main exports. But coming back to spices, I recall while addressing various chambers of commerce, I said they would say specifically pepper, that we were putting up non-tariff barriers against pepper. Now, valid or not, the fact is that there was a perception that this was happening. So we did try and address it at that time, and I'm sure the government is addressing the issues like that. But I think it's more than just that. It's not the barriers that are being put up for Sri Lankan export, because Sri Lankan, for instance, investments, they have huge investments in India. Brandex, for instance, I remember during my time, even before my time, had invested heavily in the southern city of Visakhapatnam.
Yes.
And providing employment to a large number of ladies, in backward areas. So I think there was no bar. In fact, it was welcomed, and we tried to facilitate it as much as possible. However, there are some issues, and these issues are more perception-based. When I was there, we had mooted the idea of upgrading our FTA into an ETCA, Economic and Technology Cooperation Agreement. Unfortunately, it didn't make much headway. And I think the headwinds were political rather than economic. Unfounded fears like we will be swamped by Indian products, etc., and Indian, doctors and whoever else would come in. I think largely unfounded, but you must appreciate that a smaller country, a much smaller country, does have these fears. In any part of the world, you see a large country, a large neighbor in a smaller country, this sort of these sort of fears are not uncommon. So I think we need to address them very carefully. And I think it's a win-win situation. The reason why it's a win-win, because India is one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. And when there is a global slowdown, a slowdown in the
right.
global economy, India is the bright spot. And I think we would like to share our progress and whatever we've done with our neighbors. And then Sri Lanka is in many ways our closest and dearest neighbor. All our neighbors are close and dear, but Sri Lanka has a special place for us, and sometimes we forget that.
Sir, you mentioned that the JVP seems to have at least, shed its anti-India image, for want of a better word. There was a time when they were vehemently anti-Indian. Do you think it's just the president doing it, or do you think it's a party itself that seems to have toned down its...
So I think we will have to wait and see. The president, certainly, the foreign minister, making the right noises, very good speeches. I was there at the state banquet at Rashtrapati Bhavan, and the president's speech at the banquet was very good. His press interaction with the Honorable Prime Minister after the talks earlier that day, and The foreign minister had addressed at a reception the next day. I mean, addressed the people present. There were quite a few people there. So they've been saying the right things. Very important. I mean, in my opinion, the most important thing is that they will not allow their land to be used for inimical purposes against India, for anything that harms India. That's significant. So to come up with a statement like that upfront, and not once, they said it more than once, the president of Sri Lanka. So I think these are important messages that are being conveyed. As far as the parties are concerned, don't forget that the JVP is just a constituent, of course, the largest, of the National People's Party. It's an amalgamation
There's
of
a
civil
lot of parties
societies,
there, yes.
etc. So, but the JVP is at the core, as you can make out even from the president, the foreign minister, the prime minister, etc. So I think we will have to wait and see whether the party as a whole, or has shed that. I mean, I think it has, given what has happened over the last few years, particularly the economic crisis that Sri Lanka faced two years ago, and the assistance that was so readily provided by India. I think people still remember that, and they're very grateful. And the president of Sri Lanka has repeatedly said that he's very grateful, he's mindful of what India has done, and has actually come up, both the president and our prime minister, with a very forward-looking agenda for bilateral relations.
So, but when this election happened of the president, not the parliamentary elections, of course, the parliamentary elections only reinforced the president's win. I remember a lot of people said that, he might have come in on the sheer euphoria of having a sort of a dynastic kind of a person coming in to begin with. They've never had, and B, it's a leftist, at least in theory, country. But once the euphoria wears off a little, the country will again have to face issues like the IMF loans, all that kind of stuff, and that's when the real merit of this thing will come through. Is that a right assessment?
I think it is, because it's not just a revolt against the establishment. I mean, a revolt in the sense that a vote against the establishment. The established parties have been decimated. I mean, you look at the two main parties, the SLFP and the SLPP in a breakaway, and UNP and SJB, again, a breakaway of the UNP. They have all been decimated in the elections, both at the presidential and the parliamentary elections, where the NPP has won 2/3 majority. So that itself is significant. It's a vote for change. It's a vote for anti-corruption, and it's a vote against the political system as a whole. Now, the JVP or the NPP, being a comparative outsider, though the JVP has been part of the political process for many, many years, and President Dissanayake himself has briefly been a Minister of Agriculture under President Chandrika Kumara. But the fact is that they are new to power, and I think the electorate decided to give them a chance, because they represented the Aragalaya, the protest movement 2 years ago, and they represented a force for change.
Right.
That is most important. Now, as time goes by, realities dawn. The economy is still in a fragile situation. The recovery has been reasonably good, but there's a long way ahead. And the president is very clear that he will have to continue with the IMF program, that bailout, because without that, they would find it very difficult to sort of stay afloat. That would require tough decisions, because he's also one on a plank of ameliorating the conditions of the common man, of the poor people.
Right.
And to do that, he will have to see how he can balance that with commitments to the IMF that the previous government made. We know how it is in our neighborhood. We've seen Pakistan, for instance, struggling, where we've seen other countries too. So I think it's going to be a huge challenge for the government to deliver on the promise of change and on the promise of an economic recovery.
But are you generally hopeful that it's possible?
The way they're going, I think yes, and not only because the natural resilience of the Sri Lankan people. I think they're a very resilient people, but they are fortunate, and I'm saying that mindful of not be misconstrued, by my Sri Lankan friends. They're very fortunate to have a generous neighbor who, I mean, we are tied through kinship, through civilizational symbiotic links, and we are there to help. And even during this visit, our Prime Minister was very clear that we are there to help you. We did make gestures, in terms of repayment for loans taken. We've sort of given some financial assistance, converted some loans, soft loans, into grants. This shows India's generosity, and I think as long as we are doing well, I think it's important that Sri Lanka and other neighboring countries take advantage of India's progress and economic development.
The problem here lies in the fact that perhaps some people see it as a condescending kind of a gesture or an attempt to sort of, lock people in and say, you owe us now. I don't think that seems to be our government's objective at all.
Not at all. I mean, you forget that in 1991, we were in dire straits. We had to send our gold abroad. So, I mean, this is cyclical. These things happen. Sometimes they happen frequently, sometimes they don't happen so frequently. That depends on various factors, including policies of the various governments. In Sri Lanka's case, I always say that they were hit by a perfect storm. The 2019 Easter bombings, followed by COVID, followed by some misguided policies of previous governments, and the drying up of remittances, export earnings, and
tourism.
Tourism is their mainstay. I mean, if you see the figures, they've climbed back to almost 15 lakhs now per annum. I mean, tourists, but they had dropped to less than half of that during this crisis. So I think they're very well on their way to recovery, but there's a long way to go. And India has already stated that we are there to help, and not in any condescending way at all. In fact,
nor with a think of something in return.
No, because I mean, let's be real. The least you expect when you help someone that person won't do anything that works against or militates against your interests. And the President of Sri Lanka has been quite clear. I do realize that there is an undercurrent among small sections of Sri Lankans who still see that India's assistance with suspicion. But I think
most bigger countries have faced that problem anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any large country on the globe which doesn't have suspicious neighbors. And
in international relations, I think they call it Big Brother syndrome.
Absolutely.
That's the thing, that even if it's an act of altruism, people will wonder. I think it also impacts us in our personal lives now. Even if you do something good for a person, randomly, that person will wonder now that why is he doing this?
Human nature, I dare say.
That is it. But you know what? I was really struck by the fact that despite all these troubles, Sri Lanka still kept its democratic credentials intact, which is quite a feat. Look at the rest of our subcontinent, our neighbors. Whenever they've had problems, it's always been some kind of a military person stepping in or somebody stepping in, probably because the people think that they might have the capability to do it. But I found that quite inspiring in some ways.
No, I think Sri Lanka has a long and tested record of democracy. In fact, if I recall, they were the first country in this part of the world, in South Asia, that really had universal suffrage. And they have kept up their tradition, even during the Aragalaya protests where the president had to flee. It was a violent protest, no doubt, but they had to flee. They followed their constitution. The president left, and as per the constitution, the prime minister then became the acting president, and they followed the steps given in their constitution, unlike some other neighboring countries where they've sort of come up with some innovative terms and after a violent overthrow.
Now that you mentioned it, I was just reading a report in The Economist, which has put Bangladesh as the country of the year for them, Syria as the runner-up. I was wondering why Sri Lanka doesn't figure in that. It should have.
Absolutely. In my opinion, Sri Lanka is the country of the year. Economists, I think, should get real. I mean, we know which agenda they're promoting, but I think Sri Lanka, with its track record, 2 elections, September 21st, the presidential elections, and November 12th, the parliamentary elections, conducted peacefully, and the transfer of power done smoothly. Now, I think we in India tend to take it for granted. But as you pointed out, look at our neighborhood. I mean, Sri Lanka actually shines out among our neighboring countries as a beacon of democracy. And if the economists can't appreciate that, then I'm afraid, I mean, I don't want to say anything further.
It undermines the whole thing. Because I personally thought that, Sri Lanka would have figured it. Also, the way in which they sort of battle, the economic crisis and other crises, not just
Absolutely.
the politics.
Absolutely. I mean, I think prudent policies, both by the previous government after the crisis of 2022 and now the current government, has ensured that Sri Lanka is well on its way to recovery. It will take time, of course, because the abysmal condition their economy was in 2022. It will take time, but they're well on their way to recovery. With prudent policies, they will get there.
Now that's, a very sort of a positive thought. I think we're running a bit out of time. So what I'd suggest is that, another question that I was keen to ask you is that I was just reading another article in, I think, Global Times, which had this peculiar kind of a opinion. It's a very long article, which basically argues that India seems to get a big charge out of, neighboring countries coming and saying, you're it and we don't want to work with China and things like that. And we got very, apparently, according to the article, we got very upset when the Nepalese Prime Minister went to China first. And, not us. Whereas they say that China doesn't bother about these things. They assume that the countries will choose on their own. They don't care whether they choose India or China. I am not quite sure I agree with them, but is there some merit to that statement?
Well, I think it depends on the country you're talking about. For instance, certain neighbors of ours, there's been a tradition that after elections, the leader visits India first. It's symbolic.
Absolutely.
The close ties and when that tradition is broken, then obviously people in India and elsewhere start wondering why that was done. And I don't want to name countries, but I know that in a particular country, the leader went somewhere else first and went to 2 or 3 countries. And the relationship, in fact, if you remember the India Out program in that country,
very much so.
And now look at the state of play there, the bilateral relationship. So I think we need strategic patience when we are dealing with our neighbors, and we need to persevere. However, I think we should also be mindful of not making intemperate comments. And I'm not saying the government doesn't do that, but the commentariat, the people, and social media. Social media is something that nobody can control, but we should exercise self-restraint, because that sometimes is misconstrued. And I dare say that the Global Time the article that you're referring to is probably taking, social media comments, etc., and conflating it with,
doing it deliberately as well, just to sort of,
Perhaps. But what I'm trying to say is that we must maintain very close relations with our neighbors, give them a certain freedom of choice, freedom of movement, freedom of space. That's very important, because otherwise it's overpowering for a neighbor. However, we have to be acutely conscious of what is our security concerns. The red lines that we draw should not be in the sand. Those red lines should be conveyed clearly, unequivocally to our interlocutors in our neighboring countries, and we then hope that they would respect those red lines and engage them in conversations, engage them in dialogue, and do not resort, and we don't do that. In India, we don't, to megaphone diplomacy or talking to each other through the media or other such open channels.
Some people, it looks like we're talking at each other than to each other, but that's a different thing. Last question, sir. What I'm hearing from you is that basically the policy that we followed with the Maldives, where despite their anti-India, whatever it is, we said, you know what, we're not going to do a knee-jerk reaction. We're going to actually ramp up our aid. And we'll continue with whatever relationship we have. We're not going to let that one thing, hold the whole relationship or hijack the whole relationship. But is that policy applicable to all people at one time? Because I think we tried to apply it to Bangladesh, and I'm not so sure it's going to work.
See, each case is different. I mean, what happened in the Maldives that you referred to, what happened in Sri Lanka, because after all, this year, or the last few years, I've seen a lot of instability in our region. I mean, Pakistan is a
course.
classic case of political instability and economic ruin, if I might say, the way things are. But you mentioned Bangladesh. Bangladesh has just happened a few months ago. I personally feel we need to show strategic patience. However, we must be very clear that the circumstances obtaining in Bangladesh today are different from what the situation was in Maldives. And you can draw rough parallels, but I don't think they're exactly the same.
Of course
and
not.
we will need, because I think in Bangladesh there's something more happening. In Bangladesh, I'm not the expert on Bangladesh, so I've never served there. So I don't, but I suspect there is something more. In the sense, are there, and I'm asking this question, I think everyone would have their own answer, are there external forces at play there, or have been at play there, which have vitiated and complicated the situation, not just in the region, but even for a country like India, a close and very dear neighbor of Bangladesh?
No, I'm quite sure the answer is yes. There's no, I mean, denying it, because the circumstantial evidence all points to that. Because, you can't suddenly have a revolution and then already have a guy in charge who suddenly decides to come in and I'm ready to be president. I'm not sure.
As I said, I don't want to comment.
Yeah,
more,
but
because
that's
I'm
me
not
saying it.
Yes, but I understand. Obviously, I mean, you have posts like chief advisor, etc. But anyway, we're not talking about Bangladesh.
We're not talking about Bangladesh, but I just
Sri
brought it up
Lanka.
because, I thought that, you can't possibly, you were rightly said, you can't possibly translate one policy. You have to tweak it according to the neighbor or the conditions there.
Exactly. And be mindful of the ground realities in that country. That's something very important. We have to have our ears to the ground. And we must know what's happening and then shape your policies accordingly. And I think sometimes we are, and that's natural, we tend to be reactive to changes that are happening on the ground. Sometimes things happen so fast that you've had no time to really digest. You have to react. But by and large, I think we have been able, I mean, as far as our neighborhood is concerned, it's very important because this government, for instance, has been stressing on neighborhood first, the neighborhood first policy. And you can see the allocation of resources or the official assistance given by India. The annual budgets, these are open documents, people can see. The focus on the neighborhood is apparent. The efforts made at the highest level in government in India to reach out to their counterparts is that way truly commendable. So we will keep trying. We will keep trying to help as much as we can. Of course, our partners have to reciprocate and have to see for themselves the benefits of engaging closely with, as I again repeat, one of the fastest growing economies in the world.
And let's, close with another question on Sri Lanka. The other thing that people were talking about when I was trying to, cover the presidential election is that we are, the military interaction, yes, they have a problem with us not being allowed to post people in Chennai, that training college for officers.
And Wellington, Defense Services Staff College. Yeah.
So, but they see it as a very minor thing, but they see it as an issue that needs to be resolved, because they're saying, how is it that a state is dictating terms to the federal structure when it's a government to government kind of a thing. But more importantly, they keep saying that we don't really have, other than Indian tourists traveling to Sri Lanka, and one actually told me that you guys act like rich Americans when you come into our country, but that's a different story. That's not. But they said that even our people are seen with a bit of suspicion when we go into India because of the earlier association with. Is that correct?
So, you have to see that. I think you can't make such a general. Number one, just to address your question on the Defense Services Staff College, the first thing, even before I landed in Sri Lanka, was to tackle the withdrawing of 2 Sri Lankan officers from Wellington because of local politics, state politics, etc. But we didn't allow that to really start. If I had to tell you the extent of defense cooperation and engagement that we have, the Sri Lankan Navy, the Sri Lankan Army, the training exercises. I was at Goa, Goa shipyard in 2015, if I remember correctly, where the two offshore patrol vehicles that were being made for the Sri Lankan Navy, where there was the hull cutting, and the Sri Lankan Navy commander, they call their chief, the Navy commander and the Army commander. The Navy commander had come and we were there together. So that those links, I mean, our naval academy trains a very large number of Sri Lankan naval personnel, other ranks and officers. We have regular training exercises, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and others. So it's a very, very close engagement. Let's not, I mean, the framework of defense cooperation, we can sign agreements, which is very good. We must sort of put it up front, but there already exists, and for not since now, I mean, since quite some time back, even during the Civil War, but then I'm talking now after the Civil War, very close defense cooperation between our two countries. So that already exists. As far as tourists are concerned, I think we have been talking about the Ramayan trail there, which is of great attraction to Indians who go there, and the Buddhist trail, the Buddhist circuit in India. I come from Bihar. My father was born in Gaya. So I know the importance of Buddhism. I used to proudly say when I was in Sri Lanka that Prince Mahinda and Princess Sanghamitra, they call them Mahinda and Sanghamitra, we call them Mahendra and Sanghamitra. So because the Third Buddhist Council, and that's another exercise in Patliputra, the sapling of the Bodhi tree was taken by Princess Sanghamitra from Bodh Gaya to Sri Lanka. And when the original Bodhi tree was cut down by an invader in 1193, it was replanted with a sapling from Anuradhapura, the Mahabodhi tree there. So that is why when Prime Minister Modi went there in 2015, the significance of Prime Minister Modi and the then President Sirisena praying together in front of the Mahabodhi tree in Anuradhapura was electrifying, actually. I was there, so I know how people reacted to that. So these links are there. I mean, suspicion, yes, terrorists, LTT, but LTT has been decimated. But yes, you have to be careful. In the past we've had issues. We have a diaspora from Sri Lanka, refugees staying there. But I think that issue is by and large in the past. We have managed to get over that. And I think there's a healthy flow of Indian tourists are the largest. Right. Last figures I had was over 3 lakhs out of 15 lakhs, or more than 3 lakhs were Indian. So I think there's potential for many more tourists going there. So I think it's a win-win situation for both the countries.
So the last question, would you agree then that, in some ways Sri Lanka has turned a page, perhaps India too has turned a page, and both for the better? I mean, is that a correct assessment from what I've been hearing from you?
No, certainly, but I think the most important thing is if our relationship is immune to changes of government on either side, that speaks about the maturity of the relationship. And I hope we have reached that stage, and I think the recent visit of President AKD, as he's known, shows that. So I think that is the important thing, and then when the relationship remains insulated from such political changes, it shows how deep-rooted and how mature they are.
That's a wonderful way to close the thing. I think I'd like to thank you, A, for enlightening me to begin with, because I think I had come in with some other things, and B, thank you so much for joining us at such short notice to talk to us about Sri Lanka.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. That was Ambassador Yash Sinha, who, among other things, has served in Sri Lanka, talking to us about the visit of President Dissanayake and the implications. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.